Hand back to Senator Patterson. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Governor. I have some questions arising out of the most recent Monetary Policy Board statement, but you also just alluded to the issue in your last answer there. To quote the statement, you said, and I quote, "Data from the June quarter show that private demand is recovering a little more rapidly than expected, taking over from public demand as the driver of growth." I'm firstly interested in the second part of that statement, the taking over from public demand as a driver of growth. Could you just unpack that for me? It's fair to say, isn't it, that public demand has been largely the driver of growth up until recently?
So it's been true up until sort of the end of last year, I think, probably, that for the past couple of years, household consumption, which is a big driver of private demand, has been very weak, and we discussed some of the reasons for that. Real incomes had been declining, people weren't feeling confident. Interestingly, people had jobs, but interest rates were rising and it had remained high, so all of these sorts of things were playing into that. And during that period, public demand was in fact filling that gap that consumption and investment wasn't filling. So what we've seen more recently is we have seen growth in public demand ease, and that's, as we've discussed, with all those other factors, we're seeing consumption at the same time, recover at the same time. So we're seeing a swing in how the private sector, as we've described, has taken over from the public sector as driving some of the growth.
Yeah, I do want to come to that aspect of the statement in a moment, but just firstly, just dwelling for a moment on the public demand driving growth for the last couple of years. It's interesting to me that you've described, very strong public demand filling the gap, perhaps, but it's also come at a time when we've had, I think, one of the tightest tightening cycles in history. Is that right? Is there any more rapid period of tightening? No,
it was probably the interest rates rose most rapidly than they ever have. I think it was the most.
But from the lowest point.
From the lowest point, from practically zero. So, yes. You do need to emphasise that we were coming from zero.
Indeed. Yeah, good point. But as you say, that tightening cycle is one of the things that's contributed to the weakness of private consumption. Obviously, households have been squeezed by rising interest rates. Seems slightly incongruous to me then that you've got rapidly growing or fast public demand, a rapidly tightening cycle of interest rates and weak private demand. It seems to me that suggests that public demand was contributing to the need for the increasing in interest rates in that period.
So I've talked a little bit about this before. Obviously, we don't control fiscal policy. No. We control monetary policy, and we take fiscal policy as given. What fiscal policy was doing, I think, in that period, and they were doing it during COVID, to support the economy through what was a pretty bad period, quite frankly. And at the same time, just aside from that, the public sector has to provide services and infrastructure to the Australian economy. They've got to balance all these different demands on their purse. And so what they do with that is their decisions and the government's decisions. We take it as given. What would have happened if public sector demand didn't fill that gap? Would interest rates have been lower? I don't know. They might have been. But it's also true that you might have ended up with much lower employment and other impacts on the economy. So my observation would be that where we find ourselves now, which is the private sector starting to recover, growth in public sector starting to ease off, we've got a good unemployment rate so far, we've got inflation back in the band, we're in a pretty good spot.
Surely, though, just as a matter of simple economics, all else being equal, had public demand been softer, interest rates could have been lower. We can't say with confidence how much lower, but there are only a few components that make up demand, and had one of those been softer, it would have had implications for interest rates and inflation.
It might have. It also might have been that interest rates had to be lower because the economy was actually much, much softer and doing much less well. and employment doing much less well. So I can't tell you the counterfactual.
Yeah, that's fair, and I can't hold you to the statements of your predecessor, but your predecessor has publicly said that government spending made his job harder during this period.
I don't recall Phil saying that. It's
I'll have to find the exact
possibly
quote.
said it, I don't know.
Possibly going the other way.
Pardon?
Possibly going the other way.
What do you mean by that?
Prior to the pandemic, we were trying to generate more
true.
wage growth and inflation and encouraging spending, particularly in infrastructure.
And the government were basically cutting back on government spending. That might have been what he was referring to.
Well,
governments.
Let me tell you exactly what he said, and I'm quoting from an article in the Financial Review on the 19th of August this year. Headline, Labor spending made RBA's job harder, low. Former RBA Governor Philip Lowe says the federal government has no budget discipline and its cost of living spending on households made it harder for the central bank to fight inflation. That's the AFR's summary. Going down to his direct quotes, quote, after COVID, we haven't really got back to a clearly articulated framework for decision-making with fiscal policy, Lowe said in a frank remark released on the first day of the government's economic reform roundtable in Canberra. Those frameworks are really important in disciplining the political process. It seems to be where there is a need, we'll spend. He goes on to say further down in the article, I just want to make sure I'm being accurate in quoting him.
Well, it's certainly Phil Lowe is Phil Lowe is free to say what he likes. I'm not going to comment on what he said.
Okay, fair enough. As I said, I can't hold you to the observations of your predecessor, but he was the governor during this period where interest rates were increasing, and he has said that the government made his task harder by spending too much. Coming back to the other aspect of your statement, that private demand is taking over from public demand. The June quarter national accounts, can you just unpack that for me and help me and identify why you believe that private demand is taking over from public demand?
Well, consumption was stronger than we'd expected during that period. There were some things to do with energy rebates and so on, but nevertheless it was stronger than we'd been expecting. Having said that, we had been expecting it to pick up because, as I said earlier, real incomes have been picking up, wealth has been rising, and those things generally result in, and rates have come down. So basically those things generally result in an increase in consumption. So consumption is a really large chunk of private demand. So that's what's sort of driving our, we'd been expecting it. It's starting to show up in the June quarter. It's a little bit more than expected, but you know, some of these things can jump around a bit, but nevertheless it's going in the direction we thought it should.
Yeah, just on the specific numbers in the June quarter, I have it here that growth in household consumption was 0.9%. Does that sound right to you? Yep.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Dr. Kent's nodding as well. And growth in government consumption was 1%. So government consumption was still stronger than household consumption. Is that right?
Well, much of a muchness, but...
Yeah, I mean, the other point is it's a much smaller share of the economy, so the contribution to GDP growth, particularly over the year, for government has definitely come down and private come up. So yes, the June quarter, you could focus just on that, but I think our statements are as much about sort of the trends over a number of quarters.
Yeah, I accept that. But we've certainly not reached that crossover point where household consumption is growing faster than government consumption, have we?
No, but that's to Dr. Kent's point. Because consumption is a much larger component of GDP, it is taking over as the stronger driver. That's the point.
Your statement, though, the Monetary Policy Board statement does point to June quarter data specifically. It doesn't talk about the trend over time. Maybe that's what it was referring to, but it says data for the June quarter show that private demand is recovering a little more rapidly expected and taking over from public demand as the driver of growth. Has it really taken over that yet? Or is it just on a trend too?
I think it's looking to do, that's the June quarter data suggests that. You can, we do not say that one quarter therefore makes a trend. No, we don't say that. But again, as I've said, this is something that you would expect to be happening given what else we're seeing happening with real incomes. So we've been expecting this. This is part of the process of lower interest rates, rising real incomes, lower inflation and reasonably strong labour market.
Yeah. So obviously the other part of demand is investment. I understand that the June quarter figures for private investment are 0.1%. Does that accord with your numbers?
0.1. It's not. Depends on. Are you talking about a year-ended number or a quarterly number?
Good question. That is what I'm told. The numbers I've got in front of me.
Well,
I think it's the quarterly figures, but anyway.
Business investment, if you think about it over the past year, has been reasonably solid. It has been.
For clarity, I'm talking about private investment, and I think business investment is one component of private investment. But again, correct me if I'm wrong. You will know better than me.
Well, if you've business, yes, yeah.
That's
so
right.
what do you? So I mean. Well, ask the question and then we'll...
Yeah, and so in the June quarter, public investment was down 6.7%, but obviously that's a lumpy figure, right? We're talking about infrastructure projects. And growth of private investment was 0.1%, and as I understand it, the component of business investment is even more flat than that. That doesn't indicate roaring good health, does it?
Well, again, it's... it's a quarterly number, and we've made the same point with consumption. It's a quarterly number, so you can't read sort of ups and downs. But business investment, private investment has been actually not doing badly. If you take mining out, it hasn't been doing too badly on some things. So software, for example, has been doing quite well. Data centres has been doing quite well. So there are some components of investment that are doing fine.
Yeah. I guess I'm just trying to understand is your level of confidence about private investment replacing private consumption replacing public demand, because we've heard across Treasury and Finance estimates this week that real government spending growth was 5.5% last year. Real growth in the economy was 1.4%. So at least last financial year, public spending is growing at 4 times the rate of the economy. That doesn't sound to me like the step change handover. Let's see what happens in this financial year. Maybe decisions of government will alter that. But the trajectory we seem to be on is still for very strong public demand and reasonably modest private demand.
Well, again, I think you've got to come back to the point about contributions and the contribution of the private side of things is actually starting to increase. So I think that's what we're talking about. We're starting to see that shift. So I think the contributions are telling you the story.
But if federal government spending continued on that trajectory, and obviously state governments are a component, and I haven't tallied up all their numbers, but if federal government spending continued on that trajectory, it wouldn't be a handover from public demand to private demand. It would be kind of continuing strong public sector demand at that rate, wouldn't it?
Well, I can't say what's going to happen with public demand in the future. We just take whatever Treasury have for their forecasts, and with our current forecast, using their current forecast, we continue to see private demand picking up over the next year and starting to take over from public.
Our GDP growth forecasts of around 2% over the next year and a bit. Most of that is from private demand.
Hope we get
There's
that.
still a quantum from public,
Yep.
and it's federal and state.
Yeah. Well, I hope we get to that. Chair, I have questions on a different topic, but if you want to rotate the call.
Yeah, you're almost at 15 minutes.
Let's
so,
do that then.
Let's rotate.
Thank you.